It's great to welcome back to the program Larry Norden, who's Deputy Director of the Democracy Program at NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice. Larry, for all the talk about what took place during the last election and sort of the importance of these midterm elections, depending on what your political views are, there's surprisingly little discussion of what has been done to ensure election integrity in these midterms that are coming up in November. So, I guess first, big picture it for us. Rate your confidence that we're going to have full and fair elections in November of 2018.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a good place to start when we're talking about this is what we mean by election interference. That term gets used a lot, particularly as applies to the 2016 election, and it can mean a number of things. So in 2016, we know that the Russians, Kremlin-directed, purchased political ads sorry about that, purchased political ads on platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter and elsewhere. And that's something that we've gotten somewhat of a handle on. The government hasn't necessarily done all that much. I expect that we're likely to see some more of that stuff, but the social media companies themselves have done a little bit more about that, so that at least if it and when that happens again in the 2016 election, and every reason to believe that it will, as I said, it'll be a little bit more obvious, and advocacy groups, the public, reporters can call that out when it happens. So that's one aspect. I think when you talk about election integrity, a lot of people talk about election integrity, they mean a second aspect, which is the election infrastructure itself. And there again, there are a few parts to that. There are the voting machines, which I think is what most people go to immediately when they think about, is somebody messing with our elections through cyber attacks, and making sure that those are recording votes accurately. But there are also many other election systems that we use to conduct elections. They're the registration systems, right? That's what tells us who is entitled and not entitled to go vote on those machines in the first place. There are electronic poll books that might be used in polling places that we use to provide that registration data in the polling place on election day. There are election websites which might tell people what polling places to go to, and also provide election night reporting to vote totals. And we need to protect all of those. So in terms of how confident I am, we are doing much more than we ever had to secure that election infrastructure, in part in response to the 2016 election. There are far more cyber trainings of election officials to make them aware of how to defend the systems. Congress recently allocated $380 million to the states to spend on election system security. And there have been upgrades that have been happening at the state and county level of these various systems. Having said all that, we're not doing as much as I would like. And certainly I can point to specific things ahead of the 2018 election that I'd like to see happen that probably aren't going to happen, and I think we really need to push for ahead of 2020. Most obviously, we still have paperless voting machines in the U.S., which election system security experts are nearly unanimous. The Department of Homeland Security, the intelligence agencies, the intelligence committees from the Senate and the House have said these need to be replaced with systems that produce a paper record, so that if there is some kind of intrusion against these systems, we can detect it, and we have a backup record that we can use to make sure that votes are accurate.
So along those lines, if I can jump in here with a few questions, when we talk about the reports that although there's no evidence that vote totals were changed by any kind of Russian targeting of voting systems, that those systems in 21 states, at least 21 states, were targeted. It appears as though in at least one case, Russian agents were able to access those systems, and exactly what that means, I guess, is something we could discuss. When you talk about having a paper verification of what votes were cast. Is that a mechanism that would help to counteract whatever it is that might be done through the intrusions that were attempted in 21 states, or are we talking about two different things there?
Yeah, I want to be clear about this because this gets really confusing, especially to people that don't spend a lot of time in elections or studying elections. From everything we know that's been reported about those 21 states, those were not attacks on voting machines. Those were not attempts to break into voting machines. They were either attempts to scan or to breach either registration systems or election websites, right?
Right.
So that's not where votes are counted and totaled. The one breach that we know about, and actually there was a Senate Intelligence Committee report that indicated that it was more than one state that had a breach. They didn't say how many, they said a small number. But the one state that we do know about is Illinois, and that was a breach into their registration system. And there was apparently an attempt to change some information in the registration rolls that was unsuccessful. Now you can imagine if somebody was successful in changing the rolls, the registration rolls, that could cause a lot of problems. If names are removed from a list or addresses changed so that when they show up to the polling place, they're not listed in the poll books. That could create problems. It might create long lines. The person should be given a provisional ballot, but unless they figure out what happened, that ballot might not be counted. So it's really important that states have backups of all of their registration information, and that they're auditing it, that they're checking it, and if there are problems, that there's some way to go back and figure out who should have been able to vote and to count those votes. Now that's completely separate from the other issue that we were just talking about, which is the voting machines themselves. Now those, it is theoretically possible that you could have malicious software reach those machines. It's theoretically possible that those machines could report incorrect results because they're running on software. And that's where having a paper record, now there's no evidence that happened, I want to be clear, in the 2016 election.
Right.
But that's something that we want to be really concerned about, and we want to make sure that we have something in place that will allow us to detect if that happened and allow us to recover it if that happened. And the best something in place that we could have are paper records that the voter fills out or reviews, that we know the voter said, this is my vote.
Since you work on this issue from a few angles, Larry, I'm curious, and if this starts to get beyond sort of your focus, by all means, tell us that you're sort of speculating. But if you were another country and your goal was to alter what would be the natural result of an election in the United States, what would actually be the most pragmatic path to that? Would it be trying to actually change vote tallies in machines to the extent that it's theoretically possible? Would it be disinformation campaigns through social media to actually get people to vote in a different way? I guess what I'm trying to say is, if we want to think about how we're most vulnerable to the election results being altered, what are the actual most effective paths to that if you're a foreign entity?
One thing I want to be clear about, actually, I think a good starting point is to look at what the Russians specifically have done in other countries, because they have interfered far more directly in other countries' elections in Eastern Europe than they apparently did in the United States in 2016. And one of the things that the intelligence agencies, intelligence community has told us, and the Senate Intelligence Committee said this as well, primary objective of the Russians, wherever they've operated, has been to just undermine confidence in the system in general.
Right.
In 2016, they actually did have an additional goal of favoring one candidate in the presidential race over another, but their overarching goal always is just to sow distrust in the system. And what the Russians have done elsewhere, pretty clearly, is they have targeted election night reporting, websites that deal with reporting either turnout or vote totals, that wouldn't necessarily, at the end of the day, change the outcome of the election if you have the kinds of redundancies that we have in place in the United States. but they would do an awful. Sorry about my light there.
No
We have the
problem. We
dawn
can see you.
off. um, um, uh, it, it could have a big impact on casting doubt in the election outcomes. And if you combine that with social media, and again, if you look at what the Facebook ads that were just released that the Russians had paid for in the 2016 election, some of them were focused on how you just can't trust the system. There's no point in voting. So there's this just general flow of information that is meant to cast doubt on the entire objective of liberal democracy.
Sure.
So that's point one. Now, point two, if I actually wanted to go in and change the results of, have some impact on changing the results of an election, look, there's election night reporting. We tally all our votes from machines, generally in a central place in a county or of a state, and so I might target those. But again, they're redundancies. So you have, a county might be reporting its votes that come in from all these polling places, but then you have the individual polling places and machines that are reporting results. So there's a good chance that you might, that you would, if you have good procedures in place, catch if there was at the county level or the state level with the tally, what we call tally servers, if somehow those numbers were incorrect, that you would find them. Of course, again, going back to what I said earlier, that might be, if you're Russia and you're trying to undermine confidence in the system, that might be good enough. If I wanted to go after the voting machines where votes are counted, the most obvious place to go would be where there were no paper records, so that you wouldn't have this independent record to check. And this doesn't take a specialist in elections to understand. You would target critical counties and battleground states if you were doing something like a presidential election and hope for the best.
In the limited time we have left, other than the paper records of the ballots that are cast, what would be the other one or two things that you'd like changed?
Well, one thing for sure, and this is something that the Senate Intelligence Committee in its report emphasized, is doing thorough vulnerability assessments. This is something that the Department of Homeland Security offers. It looks at the entire system and basically says, here is where your weaknesses are. You need to understand where your weaknesses are and fix them. And that could be in the registration system. It could be in election websites. It could be in, in the voting machines themselves, in the way that you're totaling results and reporting them. Understanding all of that and where the weaknesses are is really important. And only 14 states, last I checked, had undertaken this kind of vulnerability assessment through DHS, the really detailed one. So that's number one. I'd like to see more states doing that. Secondly is just upgrading infrastructure more generally. Voting machines are really old in the United States. We've got 43 states that are using machines that are no longer manufactured, which too often means election officials are buying spare parts on eBay, which I don't think is particularly safe. You could say the same thing about registration databases. About 40 states are using databases that were created well over a decade ago. They may be running on, particularly at the county level, on software that's no longer vendor supported, which means it's not getting the kind of security patches that it should. So just a general investment in upgrading those things. The $380 million that Congress just gave to the states is a start for that kind of upgrade, but we definitely need more money than that.
Larry Norden, Deputy Director of the Democracy Program at NYU Law School's Brennan Center for Justice. Larry, thanks for talking to us about this again.
Thanks, as always. Thanks for having me on.